What's up guys, Fedor Holz here, and today is another round of me answering your questions. The first question is from Looper, and he asks, have you ever crushed someone's soul by bluff raising any two? I would not say that I've ever crushed someone's soul by bluff raising any two, but I have a funny story about Nanonoko. Shout out to Nanonoko. We were in Canada at Cherry Island in our house, so we were online grinding, and I was doing super intense work against opponents. I started to play cash game more. I wanted to learn that side of the game, get better at the game, and I started working on HUDs. So back then you could manually build your HUDs, you could put those together, and you could build those emblems, like these visuals where, if some stat is in a certain way, then it shows you a certain visual. And what was really cool is we started looking for things where you basically could play, any two or almost any two and just exploit your opponents. And Nanonoko was actually one of the people we did it the most against. So we always had this running gag because back then I think Nanonoko was a PokerStars pro, he was perceived as this crusher, and we were like, okay, we found the Nanonoko exploit. And we really just loved getting in the lab and like finding those exploits for different types of people. And the Nanonoko exploit was, if I remember correctly, Nanonoko, shout out to Randy, he c-bet very high frequency on all streets. It must have been, more than 60 or 70% on flop, turn and rivers, out of position. When he open raised and you flat button, he just bet the flop, very high percentage of the time. When he checks though, so fold to float bet, which is kind of check fold on the flop or check fold on the turn or whatever, was extremely high. I believe it was in like the 80s, 70s, 80% on the flop, and folded a lot to turn stabs and folded a lot to river stabs. So it was basically his strategy was, okay, he bets the strong hands, he bets some bluffs, and then when he checks, he's just weak. A lot of speculative hands, you could just call in position, and then whenever, he starts betting and you have something you can call, and then whenever he checks at any point in time, you can just bet and he folds. It was really hilarious that we started flatting. I remember we were thinking about how wide can you go? So can you flat 4-7 off against him, against this cutoff open on the button? He was playing so many tables that he never saw, right? So he was just mass grinding. Like, I think he was known for playing whatever, 20 tables, 24 cash tables or so. And he just never really figured it out. So I'm not sure if it's soul crushing, but it was our any two exploit that we love to do. And Nanonoko was the first victim, so that was fun. Gabriel asks, how do I manage to get confirmation of the quality of my game? That is actually a very good question. I've spent a lot of time in my life, in my poker career, on this idea, okay, how good am I? I remember when I started playing super high rollers, I busted 12 bullets in a row. Shout out to Johnny, who was the first to approach me and tell me I should be playing high rollers and who bought my action. So he believed pretty early in me. And then I played the first high rollers. I remember it was in Prague, and then some others after, and I was like, they know my cards. I literally, every time, 2 hours later, I busted like 2-pair under 2-pair, set under straight, like flush under flush. I was just, okay, whenever I'm bluffing, they call, and when I have a good hand, they have a better hand. So I'm not sure I lasted longer than 3 hours in either one of those bullets. And then I was like, at the 12th bullet, I was like, I don't know, Johnny, I don't think, I'm not good enough. I don't beat those. And then I think that kind of started this idea that like, I just went so hard in the lab. I knew all the live players, like who they were online. And then I looked at them online. I was like, okay, I need to find their flaws. I studied their game from start to finish. I looked at every YouTube hand, Phil Grusom, Igor Kurganov, Fabian Quas, Scott Seaver, Eric Seidel, Dan Smith. Every hand that was online, I think I've watched. Their demeanor, the way they played. Whenever there was cards up, I watched all of it. I probably watched like dozens or maybe hundreds of hours of footage of like whenever there was anything visible. It was very insightful because then I started to understand, this is where I think they make mistakes. This is what I think their general approach is. This is where I think they're, too aggressive, too passive. And that was really, really cool to work around this idea like, hey, I'm maybe not good enough into I'm dissecting my opponents to a degree where I'm certain I know what they do wrong. And I built a lot of confidence out of that. And then I started playing much better. I think I got more confident live through that as well. I was like, oh, I know their mistakes, I know what they do wrong. So that helped me a lot. But in terms of my quality of play, I think a really big thing is I really try to look at my game. I try to look at how I play certain hands. I try to review hands, but I also try to review statistics very regularly. I mean, right now I'm not playing a crazy amount of volume, but back then when I looked at my database on a regular basis, minimum quarterly. And I tried to figure out what am I doing well, what am I doing wrong. I asked other players to look, what am I doing bad, what would they expect exploit to then continuously improve. And I would say that was a big reason why I improved so fast. So EV/BB per 100 was also a good measurement. I think back then I had like 12, 13 BB per 100 on the highest stakes. I think I was doing a lot of things right post-flop, and I was a red line winner as well, which I think back then there were way more moments to just win pots, non-showdown, and I think that was my strength, to figure out those moments where I can gain an advantage against my opponent. So I would highly suggest to do this on a regular basis. Be very critical with your results, with your statistics, how you play, get external feedback, and analyze your opponents until you feel like you have figured them out, or at least where their mistakes are. That also helps a lot. So this is my take on that question. The good old sun run question. I mean, it's interesting when you think about it on an individual basis. You know, there's this interaction of like, sun run. But if you look at it from my shoes, you know, I have read or heard this statement probably thousands of times in my life. And you go through these different phases in the beginning where you're just like, okay, you know, it's like now I was running really hard. People started bringing it up. It's like, oh, sun runner, like you run so well. And they make those comments. And then it's interesting because then it never stops, right? Then it's in all occasions from like all angles. Whenever there's something that like confirms that statement, then it's just again. So then you go a bit through frustration. I was really frustrated like 3 years later when I wasn't doing so well, and still like I win 1 all-in out of 10, and it's like, oh, how can you sun run? And that can be frustrating. And I would say now I'm at a point where I don't really care so much about it anymore. I would say that I ran very clearly above dollar EV in my career. The accomplishments I'm really proud of is that I think I outsmarted my opponents in a lot of ways. I think I outworked them in a lot of ways. And I would say there were very few opponents that I met where I would say they have either outsmarted or outworked me, or both. And that's something I'm really proud of. So that's regarding my career. And then in terms of the outcomes, it's like, yeah, what can I do for it? I had good luck in some meaningful moments that led to some really good results. But I also think that I did a lot to put myself in that position for that even be remotely possible, or even if it was a top 3% run or a top 5% run or whatever. If I would have been the worst player, then it would have been a top 0.0001% run maybe. So yeah, I was lucky. I ran pretty hot. That's what it is. I can't give advice on what to do about it. Like I would love to. I think keep positive thoughts. Like a lot of times the focus matters a lot. When I'm running poor, I can tell everything shifts to seeing more things that confirm that bias. And when you run well, you don't really think about it. So I've learned that there's a lot of value in trying to take your thoughts away from these confirming negative thoughts, because it has an impact on your play. And when you play worse, you're less likely to run good or feel like you're running good. I would say that's probably the biggest impact you can have on that. The way the dice fall, unfortunately, I don't know a way. Great question regarding win rates. I would say generally, whenever you're above a certain BB per 100, you probably play too low. So in tournaments, it's probably, when you have more than, 8 to 10 big blinds per 100, you probably play too low. You can probably move up in stakes. Clearly 10. If you can't move up in stakes, then great, well done, you're one of the best in the world. In cash games, it's probably a bit different. On smaller stakes, depends on the rake, but I would say when you have more than 5 big blinds per 100, you're probably crushing. Steffen can probably give more input on that, but back then I would say, yeah, if you have 3 to 5 big blinds per 100 or more, you're doing pretty well, and you should probably be moving up in stakes. For low stakes, that might be higher. And for higher stakes, yeah, if you reach anywhere like that in some tougher games, then you're absolutely crushing again. So it always depends a bit on the competition, the stakes you're playing. So it's hard to say, but as a very, very soft rule of thumb, I would say 10 BB per 100 in MTTs and 5 BB per 100 in cash games is certainly achievable, although it can be pretty hard. Let me think about my number one tip. There's different angles you can take. There's not this like typical idea of recreational players. I would think more of players have certain leagues. Players who play for fun are more likely to share a certain type of league. But generally you see similar leagues across categories of players. I would say recreational players overvalue absolute hand strength, and they don't find unintuitive sizings. That's probably, this is now a bit abstract, but that's probably the thing I make the most money with. This idea that, think about it like this. When they get to a large sizing, for example, the easy way for them to get to a large sizing is, I have a good hand, I want to bet a large sizing. It's hard for them to get to the point, I have a bluff, I sometimes have a good hand and there I use a large sizing, so then I should be using a large sizing with my bluffs. There could be the logic of I have a bluff, I want him to fold, I use a large sizing, so that logic can be there, but in a lot of spots when that's not so intuitive, that's why they just don't have those bluffs, and when they big bet, people are greedy, they just have it. So generally, that's a good take. So most recreationals don't bluff enough, and they don't even bluff in spot they don't bluff enough in limp pots, they don't bluff in uncontested pots a lot. I would say generally they either play too passive or too loose, and once you figured out which direction, you just hammer on that direction, right? So if you figure out, oh, he's calling a lot to 3-bets and he calls hands he should never call, then he probably has this tendency in all spots. He calls to lose pre-flop, he calls to lose on a flop, he calls to lose on a turn, he calls to lose on a river, he's just putting too many chips with hands and he shouldn't. Then against that, we play value only. And once we have seen that, we have figured it out, we just, strong hands, big bets. And on the other hand, if we see he's too passive, he's not raising much, folding to 3-bets, folding to raises, not putting much chips in with weak hands, then we want to put him to the test a lot, right? Lots of 3-betting, lots of kind of one and done bets where we just see bet flop, and then when he pushes back, we give up, stuff like that. So generally, that's what I would say is one of the best exploits, basic thinking about recreational players is the moment you figure out in which direction they deviate, that's the deviation you will see almost in all directions. So I think that's a good way to think about when you play against recreational. So try to look for something that stands out, where they're maybe too loose or too passive. Most likely, most of their behavior will be in that direction. I hope that helps. Yeah, there's some great questions today. I met my girlfriend 5 years ago, I think. She was in a relationship back then. I was in a relationship back then. We were pretty good friends for a long time. She lives in Berlin. I live in Vienna, so we just saw each other every few months. We went on some trips together, just holidays. Since we travel a lot, we just often go somewhere with friends and invite other friends, and we went to Bali, which was really nice. And when we both were single, we started dating. That's 2 years ago. And she knew I was a poker player already, so this wasn't a new thing that I had to tell her. So she knew that. She knew that I was successful with that. It was never really a topic. She has zero interest in poker. She has very little idea about the rules, and I actually kind of like that. Sometimes it's nice to explain I'm playing this tournament and I just, the emotional side of things, she starts to understand much better now. She's actually really funny in that regard, that she's always when I say, oh, I just got 8th, she's like, oh, amazing, 8th place, congrats, this is big, 100 players started. And I'm like, yeah, it would be very nice to see it from that perspective. So it's actually good to, she said, whatever I tell her is oh, I got 20th. She's like, yeah, amazing, So it's every place finish is a good finish. And in that regard, it's kind of funny. But besides that, the perception, I think, didn't change a crazy amount. I would need to ask her about, she knows I take it very serious. She has no problem with it at all. And she also is not really engaging very much in the game. So talk about my experience in it. And I think that's the main thing. A coach question. It's hard. I would say generally it's hard and not so hard. So I think generally coaches and coaching and mentoring is almost always valuable, and it's also worth to put in the effort to find someone that fits you. Exploration, trying out, just the thing I would recommend. I've made so good experiences with it. I've probably tried out, 7, 8 therapists, maybe 15, 20 coaches in a variety of different fields. I've worked with lots of people who teach me different things, and I, only continued working with 3 of them. So I would say that the ratio is probably 5 to 1, 4 to 1, 4, that aren't such a good fit, and then 1 that's a great fit who you want to work with. And then there's degrees, right? Of the 4 that aren't a great fit, they're maybe good for 5 sessions where you then, okay, we don't really get much further. But I have, some coaches that just share the mindset where I really feel like they understand me, they continuously give me a lot of value. So I would really just Google, ask friends. A lot of my coaches came through recommendations. That's the best way in my opinion. And then just do a tryout session. And if you like that, do another session. And then, after 5-10 sessions, take inventory and see again if you want to continue working with them. That's how I made the best experiences. Great combo of question, man. No affiliation with BenCB. We aren't in contact. We haven't had much communication, I would say, since I stopped playing poker mostly. And I love Ice Bass. I take cold showers most of my mornings, and whenever there's an ice bath opportunity, I take it. Maybe 20 a year, I would say. So guys, this was it. These were your questions. If you have more, leave them in the comment box, please. See you guys soon.